My daughter cut me out of her life 3 years ago. Today on my way home, I saw a woman digging through trash for aluminum cans. Then I recognized the scar on her wrist. It was my daughter. I jumped out of my truck and cried, "What happened to you?" She stared at me with frightened eyes and whispered, "Who are you? Stay away from me." My whole world stopped. But that heartbreaking moment was only the beginning. What I uncovered afterward revealed a betrayal I never could have imagined. Thank you for being here on Revenge, Dad. It genuinely means the world. Quick question. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching this? Drop your city or country below. You might be surprised how many of us are sitting in the same feeling thousands of miles apart. Note some elements of this story are fictionalized for narrative and educational purposes. Similarities to actual names or locations are unintentional. The lesson, however, is completely real. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 65 years old, and for 38 years, I worked as a water systems supervisor for the city of Cleveland. I am not the kind of man who owns a second home or drives a brand new truck off the lot every 3 years. What I have is a small house in Parma that I paid off the last mortgage note on back in 2014, a pension that covers the bills with a little left over, and an old Ford F-15, that starts every morning without complaint. For most of my life, that felt like enough. Then my wife passed, then my daughter disappeared, and enough started feeling like a word I no longer understood. 3 years ago, my daughter Claire sent me a text message on a Tuesday morning. 7 words. I still have it saved on my phone, though I stopped reading it a long time ago because it does something to my chest every time I see it. "Don't look for me. I've made my choice." I called her back immediately. Straight to voicemail. I drove to her apartment on the east side. The building manager told me Claire and her husband had moved out overnight, no forwarding address. I called her husband Nolan Pierce, and he answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and unbothered, like a man discussing the weather. "Claire doesn't want to see you, Walter. Please respect her decision." I told him I wanted to hear that from her directly. He said that wasn't going to happen. Then he hung up. I filed a missing persons report with the Cleveland Police Department. The detective assigned to the case a tired-looking man named Briggs, who had the energy of someone counting down to retirement, told me 3 days later that Claire had left voluntarily. No signs of foul play, no indication of danger. An adult woman had chosen to cut contact with her family, and there was nothing the department could do about that. I hired a private investigator anyway. He found nothing. Every trail went cold within a week. What I was left with was silence. 3 years of it. I won't pretend those years were easy. My wife Ruth had passed 2 years before Claire disappeared lung cancer, and after that, it had just been the two of us. Claire would call me every Sunday evening, and we'd talk for an hour, sometimes 2, about her work, about the neighbors, about the tomatoes I was trying and failing to grow in the backyard. She laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. She was that kind of daughter. People like that don't just disappear, not without a reason. So, for 3 years, every time I stopped at a red light, every time I walked through a grocery store or passed a woman on the street, I looked at faces. I couldn't help it. It became a habit I didn't know how to break. My eyes would scan and move, and scan and move on. The way you check your mirrors when you're driving automatic, constant half hoping and half afraid of what I might find. On the afternoon of Friday, October 25th, 2024, I was driving home from Kowalski's Hardware on Broadview Road. I'd dropped off my lawnmower for a blade sharpening and a tune-up before I put it away for the winter. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was picking up blowing dead leaves in spiraling little funnels across the road. It was the kind of late October afternoon in Cleveland that makes you feel like the whole world is shutting down for the season. I was stopped at a red light on the industrial stretch of West 41st, behind a delivery van listening to a sports radio station talk about the Browns, with the kind of grim resignation that only Cleveland fans truly understand. That's when I saw her. She was on the sidewalk to my right, maybe 20 feet from the corner. A woman in an oversized gray coat, one sleeve torn at the elbow, pushing a shopping cart with a bent front wheel that kept pulling left. Her hair was tucked up under a knit hat that had seen better days. She moved slowly, stopping every few steps to lean over a trash can and check inside. I almost looked away, but something made me watch for one more second. The way she reached into the trash can, the particular angle of her wrist as she pulled out an aluminum can and pressed it flat against the cart's edge with her foot, her left wrist. My throat closed. On the inside of her left wrist, just below the palm, was a scar shaped like a crescent moon, small and pale and curved. The kind of scar that doesn't come from surgery or accident, but from a specific moment, a rusted fence post on a rainy afternoon in 2001, when an 11-year-old girl climbed over a neighbor's fence to rescue a beagle puppy that had gotten its collar caught on a wire. I know that scar. I drove that 11-year-old girl to the urgent care clinic on Pearl Road and held her hand while they cleaned the wound, and she cried, not because it hurt, but because she was scared the puppy might still be stuck. The light turned green. The cars behind me started moving. I didn't move. Someone laid on their horn, long and furious. A pickup truck swung around me, the driver shouting something out his window that I didn't hear because the blood was roaring in my ears. The woman on the sidewalk looked up at the sound, and I saw her face. It was gaunt in a way that made my stomach drop. Cheekbones too sharp, skin, weathered and dry, deep shadows under eyes that had once been bright and quick and full of whatever it is that makes a person look alive. She looked like someone had taken the woman I knew and subtracted years of sleep and meals and safety from her. But those eyes, even hollowed out, even exhausted, those were Ruth's eyes, my wife's eyes, and I had watched Claire inherit them from the day she was born. My foot hit the brake so hard the truck shuddered. I threw it into park right there in the lane, halfway through the intersection, and my hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my keys getting the door open. Claire! My voice came out cracked and too loud, scraping against the cold air. Claire! She flinched like she'd been struck. Her head snapped toward me, and for 1/2 second her face did something complicated recognition, flickering at the edges, there and then gone like a candle flame in wind. Then the fear took over. She grabbed the cart with both hands and started moving faster, now the bent wheels screeching and dragging her head down. Claire! Wait, Claire! It's me! It's Dad! She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She moved like someone who had learned through hard experience that when a stranger called your name on the street, you ran. She was fast for someone who hadn't eaten a real meal in God knows how long. I ran after her anyway, weaving between two pedestrians who stepped aside, with the annoyed expressions of people who had seen too much of this city to be genuinely surprised by anything. My dress shoes, the ones I still wore out of habit even on errand days, a habit Ruth had drilled into me across 30 years of marriage, and that I had never managed to shake, slapped hard against the cracked sidewalk, each impact shooting up through my knees, in a way that reminded me very clearly that I was 65 years old and had not run anywhere in quite some time. I ran anyway. Claire, please, it's Dad, it's Walter, just stop, please. She didn't stop. She cut left around the corner onto a narrower street, the shopping cart's bent wheel screeching against the pavement like something in pain. The sound was wrong in every possible way. Too loud, too desperate, too much like what it actually was, which was a woman who had learned that the sound of someone calling her name meant run. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning in the cold October air, my heart hammering so fast I could feel it in my back teeth and behind my eyes and in the base of my throat. I caught up to her halfway down the block. I stepped in front of the cart with both hands raised, breathing so hard I could barely form words. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because the cart was between us and she had nowhere to go without going through me, and whatever else 3 years on the streets had done to her. It had taught her to calculate those things fast and accurately. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes were wild, moving left and right with the rapid, exhausted precision of someone who has spent a very long time cataloging every exit from every situation before the situation fully arrives. Claire! I tried to get my breathing under control, failed, tried again. Please, just look at me. I don't know you, she said. Her voice was rough and scraped thin, like a piece of wood worn down by too much weather. It was the voice of someone who had stopped using language for connection a long time ago, and now used it only for the bare minimum warning refusal survival. You do know me. My own voice cracked down the middle when I said, it split open by something I couldn't hold together any more than I could have held water in a cupped hand with a hole in it. Claire, you know me. I'm your father. I'm Walter Hayes. You grew up on Forestdale Drive in Parma. Your mother's name was Ruth. You have a scar on your left wrist from the day you rescued a puppy from a fence when you were 11 years old. And you cried in the urgent care, not because it hurt, but because you were afraid the puppy was still stuck. Something moved across her face. It was not recognition, not quite. It was something that lived just underneath recognition, a shadow of the shape of a thing present and then gone before it could fully form, the way you sometimes think you hear your name in a crowd and turn and find nothing there. Her eyes stopped moving for just a fraction of a second, fixed on mine, and in that fraction of a second, I saw something that nearly knocked me off my feet. Then her face closed again. "I don't have a father," she said. The flatness in her voice was the worst thing I had ever heard in my life. Not anger, anger would have been something. Not grief, grief would have meant she remembered what she had lost. Just flatness. The voice of someone reciting a fact about the weather, about the temperature outside, about the day of the week. A fact she had told herself so many times it had stopped being something she felt and had become something she simply knew. The way you know that water runs downhill. "I don't have anyone," she said. "Please move." I did not move. "Claire, you're not well." I kept my hands up, kept my voice as soft as I could make it, the way you speak to someone standing too close to a ledge, not urgent, not pleading, just steady, just present, just there. "Let me help you. Just 5 minutes. Let me buy you something to eat. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes and some food, and then you can walk away and I won't follow you." She looked at me then. Really looked the way a person does when they are trying to determine, with the limited information available to them, whether the thing in front of them is safe or dangerous. Her eyes were sunken deep into her face, the skin beneath them, the color of old bruises, layered exhaustion, visible in every line of her. But inside that exhaustion, underneath all of it, something was still burning. Small maybe, damaged certainly, but there. "I don't need your help," she said. Her chin came up slightly. "I work. I collect cans. I sell them to the yard on South Side. I buy my food. It's honest work." "I know it is," I said. "I know. I'm not saying it isn't." "Then why are you following me?" "Because you're my daughter." The words came out simple and flat, and completely without performance, because there was nothing left in me for performance. "Because 3 years ago, you disappeared, and I have been looking for you every day since then, and today I found you, and I am not able to make myself walk away. I am physically not able to do it. I'm sorry." She gripped the cart handle so hard, her knuckles went white against the cold metal. "You don't know me," she said again. But something had changed in the way she said it. The flatness had developed a crack, thin, almost invisible, but there. Underneath the certainty was something else, something that sounded less like a statement and more like a question. She was terrified to finish asking because she didn't know what the answer would do to her. "I know you," I said. My eyes were burning, and I didn't bother trying to stop it. There was no version of this moment in which I was going to hold myself together, and I had stopped pretending there was. "I have known you since the day you were born. I was in the delivery room. I held you when you were 40 minutes old, and you grabbed my finger with your whole fist, and I was completely useless for the rest of the day." I took one slow breath. "I have been looking for you every single day for 3 years, every day, and I am not going to pretend that I haven't, and I am not going to pretend that I can just drive away now that I've found you. I can't." She shook her head, once, twice sharply, like she was trying to dislodge something that had gotten loose inside and was rattling around where it didn't belong. Then she started walking again. Not running. Walking. Pushing the cart ahead of her, the bent wheel screeching its protest against the pavement, her head down and her shoulders set. But she was walking towards St. Coleman's. I followed at a distance 20 feet back, close enough to keep her in sight and far enough not to crowd her. The distance you give a frightened animal that you were trying very carefully not to spook. The bent wheel left a thin white scrape mark on the sidewalk behind her, a continuous pale line that trailed back toward me like a thread connecting us across the gap. I kept my eyes on the back of her head, and I thought about the last time I had seen her. She had been standing at my kitchen counter on a Sunday afternoon 3.5 years ago, her hair down, laughing at something on her phone, a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because she always forgot about her coffee when something caught her attention. She had looked up when I came in and said something I couldn't remember. What something ordinary, something that would have seemed completely unremarkable if I had known it was the last ordinary thing she was going to say to me for 3 years. And then she had looked back at her phone and laughed again. I had walked past her to the refrigerator. I had no idea that was the last time I would see her as herself in her own kitchen, in her own life, before everything that was hers got taken away. You never do. That is the cruelest thing about the last time. It never announces itself. It just arrives and passes and becomes the last time, and by then it's already gone, and all you can do is carry it forward into every day that comes after, and hope that somewhere ahead of you there is a first time again. I followed my daughter toward the lights of St. Coleman's shelter, and I did not let her out of my sight. St. Coleman's smelled like canned soup and wet coats, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a room when too many people have nowhere else to go. There were maybe 30 people inside, sitting on folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A few card tables had been pushed together along one wall, where 2 volunteers were ladling soup into styrofoam cups. Someone had taped a paper turkey to the window. Thanksgiving was still a month away, but whoever put it up had apparently decided the world needed the reminder early. Claire had taken a seat in the far corner, her back against the wall, the cart parked beside her, like a loyal dog. She had her arms folded tight across her chest, and her eyes were moving, cataloging every exit, every face, every potential threat. It was the posture of someone who had learned the hard way that safety was something you had to keep earning, minute by minute. I got 2 cups of soup from the volunteers and carried them over. I set one in front of her and sat down in the chair beside her, not across from her. Beside her, the way you'd sit next to someone on a bus. Close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd. She looked at the cup but didn't touch it. "I'm not going to push you," I said. "You don't have to say anything. I just didn't want you to be hungry." 20 seconds passed. Then she picked up the cup and drank. She tried to go slow. I could see her making the effort, small sips measured, but hunger is a hard thing to argue with. And within a minute she was drinking steadily, both hands wrapped around the cup, like she was afraid someone might take it. When the soup was gone, she looked up and found me watching her, and something flickered across her face that might have been embarrassment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome, Claire." She flinched at the name. "Don't call me that. What do you want me to call you?" She didn't answer. She set the empty cup down and pulled her coat tighter, and I noticed again how loose everything was on her. The coat, the sweater underneath all of it, draped over a frame that had lost too much weight over too long a period of time. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I had one photograph pulled up already. I'd scrolled to it in the parking lot before I came in because I knew I would need it, and I didn't want my hands shaking too badly to find it in the moment. I held the phone out toward her, not pushing it into her hands, just holding it where she could see. It was a photo from May of 2018. Claire in her graduation cap and gown, standing in the backyard on Forestdale Drive, squinting into the afternoon sun and laughing at something I'd said right before I took the picture. Ruth was standing beside her, one arm around her shoulders, and around Claire's neck, catching the light, was a thin silver chain with a teardrop-shaped pendant. Claire's eyes dropped to the screen. Her whole body went still. "That necklace," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could, "belonged to your mother. She wore it every day for 22 years. She gave it to you the week before she passed and made me promise I wouldn't let you give it away or lose it." I paused. "You told me you'd wear it forever. You said that was a dumb thing to promise, but you'd do it anyway." Claire's hand moved slowly to the collar of her sweater. Her fingers slipped beneath the fabric. She pulled out a thin silver chain. The teardrop pendant caught the fluorescent light of the shelter and threw a small, bright point onto the wall beside us. My throat seized up so completely that for a moment I genuinely could not speak. I pressed my hand flat against my knee and dug my fingers in and breathed through my nose until the feeling passed enough for words. "You kept it?" I managed. "I don't know why," she whispered. Her eyes were fixed on the pendant, turning it slowly between her fingers. "I don't remember where it came from. I couldn't leave it behind. Every time I thought about getting rid of it, something stopped me." "That's because some part of you knew," I said. "Some part of you always knew." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were full of tears she hadn't let fall yet, and her chin was trembling, and she looked so much like the 11-year-old girl who had cried in the urgent care clinic because she was worried about a puppy that my chest cracked open like old wood in the cold. "He told me," she started, then stopped, shook her head hard like she was trying to dislodge something. "He said if I looked for the past, someone would get hurt." "Who said that?" Her brow furrowed, her hands pressed against the sides of her head, fingers digging in like she was trying to hold something together that was threatening to come apart. I can't," her voice rose, panicked. I don't know who said it. I just know that I'm not supposed to." She stood up so fast, her chair scraped back across the floor. Every head in the room turned toward us. Then her knees buckled. I caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than I expected so much, lighter than she should have been, and I went down with her one knee on the cold linoleum, both arms around my daughter for the first time in 3 years. "I've got you," I said into her hair. My voice was shaking badly now. "I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." I reached for my phone with one hand and called 911. The emergency room at Metro Health Medical Center on West 25th Street was the kind of place that made you understand very quickly that whatever crisis had brought you here was just one of 100 crises happening simultaneously within these walls. Gurneys moved past in both directions. Monitors beeped from behind curtained bays. A child somewhere down the hall was crying with the particular exhausted persistence of someone who had been crying for a very long time and had no intention of stopping. I sat in a plastic chair outside Bay 7 and I stared at my hands. They had taken Claire back immediately. The paramedics had flagged her as critical malnourished, possible head injury, unknown history. A nurse had asked me a rapid series of questions I could barely answer. What is her name? What medications is she on? Does she have any known allergies? I kept saying, I don't know. I haven't seen her in 3 years, and the nurse's expression did something complicated that she was too professional to let become words. I had ridden in the ambulance with my daughter and held a plastic bag containing her silver necklace. A nurse had removed it before the paramedics loaded her. And for the entire 12-minute drive, I had looked at the necklace in the bag and thought about nothing at all. Sometimes when something is too large to process, the mind just goes quiet, like a circuit breaker tripping, everything off at once. I had been sitting outside Bay 7 for 2 hours and 14 minutes when the woman in the white coat appeared. At 10:30, she came and sat down in the chair beside me. She was in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had long ago learned that what frightened families needed most was not softness, but clarity. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Dr. Sandra Wells, Neurology. I've been evaluating your daughter. How is she?" My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped thin, the voice of a man who had been holding himself together with both hands for the past few hours and was starting to feel the strain in his grip. "She's stable," Dr. Wells said. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, which we're addressing now. The malnutrition is significant based on her blood work. She's been in this condition for a considerable period of time, months at minimum." She folded her hands in her lap. "But I want to talk to you about something more complex. Your daughter has suffered a significant traumatic brain injury at some point in the past. Based on the imaging, I'd estimate somewhere between 1 and 2 years ago. The injury itself has healed, but it was never properly treated, and it has left lasting effects." I pressed my fist against my mouth and breathed through my nose. "What kind of effects?" "Dissociative amnesia," she said. "It's a condition where the brain, in response to severe physical trauma combined with severe psychological trauma, essentially locks away certain memories. Not destroys them, locks them. The information is still there, but the pathways to access it are disrupted." She paused. "Your daughter can retain new information. She can function day to day. But her autobiographical memory, who she is, where she comes from, the people she loves, that has been largely inaccessible to her. The words arrange themselves in my mind one at a time, like bricks being laid slowly in a row. So when she said she didn't know me, she wasn't lying," Dr. Wells said gently. "She genuinely could not access the memory of you. The recognition you saw flicker across her face when you described the scar, the necklace, that was her brain responding to emotional triggers. The pathways are damaged, not destroyed. There's a difference. Can she get it back? Potentially, yes." She looked at me steadily. "Strong emotional triggers, familiar objects, photographs, voices, sensory experiences can sometimes reopen those pathways. It's not predictable and it's not fast, but it is possible." She paused. "The necklace she was wearing, the reaction she had when you showed her the photograph. Those are encouraging signs, Mr. Hayes. Something is still intact in there." I nodded because I couldn't speak. "She'll need to stay with us for several days at minimum," Dr. Wells continued. "We need to address the malnutrition and dehydration first. Beyond that, I'll refer her to a specialist in dissociative disorders at the Cleveland Clinic. The road back is going to be long and unpredictable, and I want to be honest with you about that." She stood and rested a hand briefly on my arm. But she's alive, and she's stable, and she held on to that necklace. Don't discount what that means. She left. I sat there for a long time, after that watching the ER move around me like a river around a stone. Nurses crossed back and forth. A family in the waiting area across the hall huddled together, speaking in low voices. Somewhere beyond the curtain bays, a monitor alarm sounded and then stopped. The machinery of crisis running on its own rails, indifferent to any particular grief. Around midnight, a woman in a navy blazer approached me, carrying a laptop and a manila folder. She was in her mid-40s with a careful, measured walk, the walk of someone who has spent years crossing the distance between waiting rooms and bad news, and has learned to make that walk feel calm. Mr. Hayes, my name is Rebecca Okafor. I'm the patient advocate on duty tonight. She sat down across from me and opened the folder on her lap. I need to verify some information about the patient in Bay 7 before we proceed with any further treatment decisions. Can you provide documentation of your relationship? I gave her everything I had. Claire's birth certificate that I'd been carrying in my wallet for 3 years, like a talisman folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. A folder of family photographs I kept in the truck's glove compartment, 10 of them going back to Claire's childhood, faces I could name and years I could place. And the file from the private investigator I'd hired back in 2021, documenting the attempts to locate my daughter and the dead ends they had reached. Rebecca looked through all of it carefully. She did not rush. When she opened her laptop and began typing, I watched her face and I saw the moment her expression shifted. A small tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second, where something she read on the screen made her pause before she continued. Mr. Hayes, she said carefully, your daughter has been in our system before. 14 months ago, she was brought into this emergency room following a traumatic incident near the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge. At the time, she had no identification on her. She refused to provide her name. She turned the laptop so I could see the screen. She was admitted under the name Catherine Lane. The name landed in my chest like something cold and heavy. That's not her name, I said. No, but it's the name she gave when she was well enough to speak. Rebecca hesitated. There's something else. 2 days after she was first admitted, a man contacted the hospital claiming to be her former husband. He came in, filled out her emergency contact information, and requested that her records be kept confidential under HIPAA privacy protections. She met my eyes. The hospital complied. We had no reason not to. A person identifying themselves as a family member has legal standing to request privacy protections under federal law. We couldn't verify the relationship independently, and her records showed no next of kin on file. My hands, which had been lying flat on my thighs, slowly curled into fists. Who was the man? Rebecca turned the laptop back toward herself and read from the screen. The name listed as emergency contact is Nolan Pierce. She paused. There's a notation beside the entry. It reads, "Do not contact, per patient request." The fluorescent lights above me hummed their steady, indifferent hum. Somewhere down the hall, that child had finally stopped crying. I sat with what she had just told me and felt it settle through me like cold water finding its level. Nolan knew she was alive. He had known for 14 months. He had walked into this hospital, presented himself as her former husband, filled out paperwork with his name and his contact information, and then added a notation, ensuring that if anyone came looking, if I came looking, the official record would tell them that Claire did not want to be found. He hadn't just let her disappear. He had engineered her disappearance. He had filed the paperwork for it. He knew where she was, I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, too small for what they were carrying, the way sometimes the English language fails to produce a container large enough for a particular thing. This whole time, all 14 months, he knew. Rebecca closed her laptop gently. Her voice when she spoke was careful in the way of someone who has had years of practice saying difficult things without adding her own weight to them. Mr. Hayes, I think you may want to speak with the police. The police already told me there was nothing they could do. I looked up at her. My hands had stopped shaking, I noticed. That was interesting. I need something they can actually use. Rebecca looked at me for a moment, then nodded once. She left me with her card and the folder of documents and the knowledge that my daughter had been lying in a hospital bed 14 months ago, 1 mile from my house in Parma, without knowing who she was, while the man who had put her there had stood in this lobby and made sure I would never find out. I reached for my phone and found Marcus Bell's number in my contacts. Marcus and I had worked together for the city for over a decade before he moved to the Financial Investigations Unit. He'd retired 2 years ago, but some men, when you call them at midnight with something like this in your voice, don't ask whether it's convenient. He picked up on the third ring. "Walter, what happened?" "I found Claire," I said, "and I found out who's been hiding her." I got home at 2:15 in the morning. The house on Forestdale Drive was dark and cold, the way only an empty house gets. Not just the absence of heat, but the absence of everything that makes a place feel inhabited. I had lived here for 27 years. Ruth and I had bought it together the spring after we got married, when the neighborhood was a little rougher and the price was a little lower, and we were young enough to believe that the work we put into a place was the same thing as love made permanent. We had painted every room ourselves. We had replaced the porch boards one summer weekend, while Claire, who was 6, handed us nails one at a time from a coffee can and told us we were doing it wrong. Tonight it felt like a house I had never been inside. I turned on the kitchen light, put on a pot of coffee I knew I wouldn't finish, and sat down at the desk in the small room off the hallway that I had used as an office for 20 years. The desk was the same one I had used at the city, a heavy oak thing I'd bought at a government surplus auction in 2003, and carried up the porch steps with my back complaining every inch of the way. Ruth had said it was too big for the room. She had been right. I had kept it anyway. I opened my laptop. I typed Nolan Pierce into the search bar and hit enter. His face came up immediately, and I sat there for a moment just looking at it. The man I remembered from 3.5 years ago had worn cheap suits and driven a 10-year-old Nissan, and shaken my hand a little too firmly at family dinners, the way men do when they're trying to convince you of something without being able to say what. He had smiled easily and talked about his plans in the energetic, slightly breathless way of someone who believes his own enthusiasm is the same thing as evidence. I had not disliked him exactly. I had not trusted him either in the particular way. You don't quite trust a person, but can't name the reason, and so you file it away and tell yourself you're being unfair. The man on my screen was different. Same face, same jaw, same eyes that smiled, without quite reaching, but everything around him had been rebuilt. He was standing in front of a glass and steel building, in what looked like Midtown Cleveland, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck a watch on his wrist, that caught the light just so his chin at the angle of a man who has decided he deserves exactly the space he's occupying. Pierce Renewal Group, acquiring and revitalizing distressed residential properties across Northeast Ohio, building stronger communities one neighborhood at a time. I read that last line 3 times. I read it the first time thinking it was ordinary marketing language. I read it the second time, starting to understand what it meant that this man had written it. By the third time, my hands were pressed flat against my thighs to stop them from shaking. I kept reading. There were photographs of ribbon cuttings, charity galas, a check presentation to a youth housing program on the east side of Cleveland. One article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer called him a self-made success story, the kind of man who would turn personal adversity into professional purpose. Another mentioned his recent engagement to Victoria Marsh, the daughter of prominent real estate developer Harold Marsh, a connection that had the article noted approvingly opened significant new doors for Pierce Renewal Group's expansion plans. A third article, a profile in a business journal that used words like visionary and community-focused, without apparent irony, noted almost as an aside that Nolan Pierce had personally donated $200,000 to a program supporting women re-entering the workforce after incarceration. I pushed back from the desk. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there with both hands on the edge of the sink, looking out at the backyard, Ruth's garden, the apple tree, the dark shape of the garage at the far end of the yard, everything exactly where it had always been. $200,000, I thought, donated to a program for women re-entering the workforce after incarceration. I went back to the desk. I searched Claire's name. The articles came up in a cluster, all from the same 3-week period 3 years ago, all carrying that particular tone of local crime, reporting that manages to be simultaneously exhaustive and completely empty of the human being underneath the facts. The headlines were brief and matter-of-fact. Cleveland woman pleads guilty in municipal contract fraud case. Finance director admits to falsifying invoices, misappropriating city funds. Claire Pierce sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. There was a photograph from the courthouse steps, Claire in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere below the camera. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She looked smaller than I remembered, not just thinner, though she was that too, but diminished in some deeper way, like something essential had already been taken before the sentence was even read, and what stood there on the courthouse steps was what remained after the taking. Behind her, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable, stood Nolan Pierce. He was looking at his phone. I found the quote he had given to a reporter outside the courthouse. It was in the third paragraph of the sentencing article, set off in quotation marks with his name beneath it, and I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I closed the laptop because I did not trust myself to keep looking at it. I love my wife, and I always will, but I cannot stand behind actions that harm the public trust. I hope Claire finds the help she needs. I sat in the dark office for a very long time after that. Claire had never been a finance director. That was the thing that kept circling back, cutting through everything else, refusing to be quiet. She had taken 2 accounting courses at Cuyahoga Community College in her early 20s before she met Nolan, practical courses the kind that teach you how to balance a checkbook and file a basic tax return, not the kind that qualify a person to oversee the financial operations of a construction and renovation company. After they married, she had helped him with invoices a few hours a week, scheduling payments, organizing receipts, making sure the utility bills went out on time. The kind of bookkeeping work that any careful, methodical person could do. She was careful and methodical. She balanced her own checkbook to the penny. She kept every receipt in a little accordion folder, sorted by month and category. She was not someone who committed federal fraud. She was someone who trusted the wrong person, and that is a different thing entirely. And the law, in my experience, does not always know the difference. I reached for the phone. Gerald Fitch. The name was in the third article listed as Claire's attorney at sentencing. I found his number through the Ohio State Bar Association's online directory. His practice was in Lakewood, 3 miles west of where I was sitting. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation in equal measure. Mr. Fitch, my name is Walter Hayes. Claire Hayes is my daughter. I need to ask you about her case. A pause. Long enough to tell me the name registered. The case is closed, Mr. Hayes. Ms. Pierce entered a guilty plea. There's nothing to discuss. She entered a guilty plea because someone put her up to it. The silence that followed this was of a different quality. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man deciding how much of what he's thinking he's willing to say out loud. I'm not able to discuss the specifics of a former client's case, he said finally. Attorney-client privilege survives the conclusion of representation. You understand that? I understand that, I said. So, let me ask you something that doesn't require you to discuss specifics. A yes or no question. Did you think she did it yes? The silence this time lasted long enough that it stopped being a pause and became its own kind of answer, the kind that a man gives when the honest response and the professional response are pointed in opposite directions, and he's trying to find a way to honor both. You should talk to her husband, Gerald Fitch said finally. Her former husband. His voice had something careful in it that hadn't been there at the beginning of the call. That's all I can tell you. Then he hung up. I set the phone down on the desk. Outside, the sky over Parma was starting to change that thin gray pre-dawn light that looks less like morning arriving and more like night losing its nerve. I had not slept. I was not going to sleep. My coffee had gone cold beside the laptop untouched. I thought about Claire's face in that courthouse photograph. The particular angle of her head, eyes down, hands clasped, the posture of a person who has made a decision they know is permanent and are trying to carry it without collapsing. I had seen that posture once before, a long time ago at Ruth's diagnosis, sitting in a hospital consultation room, while a doctor said words that rearranged the rest of our lives. The posture of someone absorbing something enormous and deciding in real time to absorb it quietly rather than fall apart. I had thought then that it was the bravest thing I had ever seen. Now I thought about my daughter standing on courthouse steps wearing that same expression, and I felt something open up in my chest, that I did not have a name for rage and grief and love and guilt all compressed together into something that had no clean edges and no clear direction except forward. I picked up my keys from the corner of the desk. Nolan Pierce's office was on East 12th Street in Midtown Cleveland, 40 minutes from my front door on an empty Sunday morning. I had never been the kind of man who made decisions in anger. 38 years of city work, managing crews navigating bureaucracy, fixing broken infrastructure in freezing weather at 3 in the morning, had taught me that anger was a tool that cut the hand holding it more often than it cut anything else. I had learned to work through it slowly, methodically, the way you work through a problem with a pipe that won't cooperate. Assess, plan, proceed. But I was also a father, and some things in the end don't wait for calm. I walked out to the truck and started the engine and sat there for a moment in the dark driveway, watching my breath fog in the cold air, thinking about a man who had donated $200,000 to help women coming out of prison, while the woman he had put there was sleeping in a shelter and collecting aluminum cans to buy food. Then I backed out of the driveway and drove toward the highway. The lobby of Pierce Renewal Group occupied the ground floor of a building that had been renovated so aggressively it no longer remembered what it used to be. Glass everywhere, polished concrete floors, a reception desk made of something pale and expensive that might have been marble or might have been a very convincing imitation of it. A young woman behind the desk looked up when I walked in, her smile professional and immediate. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "Tell Nolan Pierce that Walter Hayes is here. Tell him it's about his ex-wife." The smile held, but her eyes changed. She picked up the phone. I stood in the middle of that lobby with my hands at my sides and my jaw set, and I looked at the frame photographs on the wall, ribbon cuttings, groundbreakings, Nolan shaking hands with people in suits, and I thought about Claire eating soup out of a styrofoam cup in a church shelter because she had nowhere else to go. 4 minutes later, Nolan Pierce walked out of the elevator. He looked exactly like his photographs, which is to say he looked like a man who had spent considerable time and money ensuring that he looked effortlessly successful. The suit was charcoal gray. The watch was the same one from the website. He crossed the lobby with his hand already extended, his face arranged into an expression of cautious pleasantness. And for one surreal moment, I thought he was actually going to try to shake my hand. Instead, I grabbed the front of his jacket with both fists. The receptionist made a sharp sound. 2 men in security uniforms appeared from somewhere to my left and moved toward us. Nolan raised one hand toward them without looking away from me. A single flat gesture. They stopped. "Walter." His voice was very calm. "You want to do this here, or you want answers?" I released him, stepped back. My hands were trembling so badly I had to press them against my thighs. "Upstairs," he said. "Come on." His office was on the 12th floor corner, position windows on 2 sides, looking out over the gray October skyline of Cleveland. He poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher on his desk and did not offer me one. He sat down. I did not sit. "She's in the hospital," I said. "In case you were wondering, Metro Health. She's been living on the streets for over a year. She doesn't know who she is." Something moved behind his eyes, gone before I could name it. "I knew she was struggling," he said. "You knew she was alive." My voice came out harder than I intended, each word landing separately. "You went to that hospital 14 months ago, and you put your name on her file so nobody could contact me. You knew exactly where she was, and you made sure I couldn't find her." He looked at me without flinching. "She didn't want to be found. She didn't know who she was looking for." I took a step toward the desk. "Why did she plead guilty, Nolan? She was never your finance director. She helped you file invoices. She didn't have the access or the authority to run the kind of scheme she was convicted of." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the glass of water slowly in his hand, watching the light move through it like a man with all the time in the world. "The company had problems," he said finally. "Financial irregularities. When the city auditors started asking questions, they needed someone whose name was on the documents. And her name was on the documents because you put it there." He didn't deny it. He set the glass down with a small, precise click. "I told her that if the investigation expanded, you would be implicated," he said. "You had signed technical certification documents for 3 of our renovation projects. In an aggressive investigation, a prosecutor could have argued that you were part of the scheme from the beginning, that you used your position with the city to validate work that was never properly done." My chest went cold. Those were standard inspection sign-offs, routine paperwork. I signed them after I retired as a favor. Claire didn't understand the legal distinction. He said it without any particular emphasis, the way you might note that it had rained last Thursday. I explained to her that a federal investigation into construction fraud could result in charges against you, loss of your pension, forfeiture of your house, Possible imprisonment. He paused. She asked me if there was a way to keep you out of it. The room seemed to tilt slightly. You told her to confess, I said. You told her to take the whole thing herself. I told her what her options were. You lied to her. My voice was shaking now, and I didn't try to stop it. Those certification documents were completely unrelated to the fraud. No prosecutor would have touched me. You knew that, and she didn't, and you used it. He met my eyes. She made her own choice, Walter. She made her choice because you terrified her into making it. I leaned forward and put both hands flat on his desk, close enough that I could see the slight involuntary tightening around his eyes. You took 18 months of her life. You took her career and her health and her memory, and 3 years of every morning I woke up not knowing if my daughter was alive. And you're sitting here talking to me about choices. He leaned back in his chair, composed, untouchable. The expression on his face was something close to pity, which was the worst possible thing it could have been. I'm sorry things worked out the way they did, he said. I genuinely am. But the case is closed. Claire pled guilty. There's nothing to revisit. I straightened up. I picked up my jacket from where it had slipped off my arm. I walked to the door. Then I stopped. You made one mistake, I said, without turning around. What's that? You let her survive. I walked out. I did not look back. I rode the elevator down 12 floors, staring at my own reflection in the polished steel doors, and what I saw there was a 65-year-old man who had just heard a confession that no court would ever accept, and who needed very badly to find someone who could do something about that. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus Bell. Marcus Bell lived in a duplex on Broadview Road in Old Brooklyn, 10 minutes from my house. And when I pulled up at 8:30 that Sunday morning, he was already standing on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. He was 62 years old, broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years looking at financial documents that people had tried very hard to make confusing and had learned that patience was the only tool that never broke. He had spent the last decade of his career running financial investigations for the city of Cleveland before he retired 2 years ago. We had worked together on 3 infrastructure audits in the early 2000s. I trusted him the way you trust a level, not because it tells you what you want to hear, but because it tells you what's actually true. I sat down on his porch steps and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, both hands wrapped around his mug, his eyes steady on the middle distance. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone sorting through what they'd just heard and deciding where to start. The certification documents you signed, he said finally. You have copies. In my filing cabinet at home, I kept everything. Good, he stood up. Go get them. Meet me back here in an hour. Marcus had converted his dining room into a workspace, 2 folding tables pushed together, a large monitor, a printer, and stacks of folders organized with the kind of precision that made my own filing system look embarrassing. By 10 o'clock that morning, we had my certification documents spread across one table, and the court records Marcus had pulled from the federal case database spread across the other. The certification documents were straightforward. 3 separate inspections I had conducted on residential renovation projects in 2019 after I retired from the city. Each one confirmed that the plumbing and water systems in the renovated units met Cleveland's residential code standards. My signature at the bottom, my license number. Nothing about budgets, contracts, or money of any kind. Then Marcus laid 3 other documents beside them. These are from the court record, he said. Financial guarantee agreements filed as part of the prosecution's evidence. They bear your name, and they purport to establish that you vouch for the financial integrity of those same 3 projects, not just the plumbing, the materials, the labor costs, the contract values, everything. I looked at the signatures at the bottom of those documents. They looked like mine, same general shape, same proportions. Someone had done careful work. And that's not my signature, I said. I know. Marcus picked up one of the guarantee documents and held it next to one of my inspection certificates. Look at your W. The way you write it, the first stroke comes down lower than the second before it comes back up. Every time consistent. On these guarantee documents, both strokes are even. Whoever copied your signature didn't notice that detail. He set the papers down. Under 18 United States Code, Section 5, 13, producing a forged financial document in connection with a federal case carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. Whoever did this didn't just frame Claire, they committed a serious federal crime in the process. My hands were pressed flat on the table. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Can we prove Nolan did it? Not yet, but the documents had to originate somewhere, and paper always has a history. Marcus sat down and turned to his monitor. I spent this morning pulling the corporate registry for Pierce Renewal Group and its affiliated entities. Nolan didn't just run one company, he ran 11. He turned the monitor toward me. 11 company names, 11 different registered addresses scattered across Cuyahoga Summit and Lorain counties. 11 sets of articles of incorporation filed over a period of 4 years. 11 companies. Marcus said, but when you follow the money, the invoices, the payments, the intercompany transfers, it all flows in one direction, down through the subsidiaries through shell accounts, and eventually into a single investment fund. He pointed to a name at the bottom of the screen. This fund was opened approximately 8 weeks before Claire entered her guilty plea. The registered controller is Nolan Pierce. So Claire took the fall, I said slowly, while the actual money was sitting in a fund he controlled. That appears to be what happened, yes. Marcus leaned back in his chair. But I need someone who was on the inside, someone who can tell me how the documents moved, who had access to what accounts, and how your signature ended up on papers you never signed. He looked at me. I'm going to reach out to some former employees of Pierce Renewal Group, people who might have processed these documents without understanding what they were part of. If anyone has something to say, the threat of being implicated themselves is usually enough to make them say it. He made 3 calls that afternoon while I drove home. Denise Carter called him back within the hour. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Walter Hayes, I answered. A pause. Then a woman's voice, careful and slightly breathless, like someone who had been working up to making a call for a long time and was afraid of losing her nerve. Mr. Hayes, my name is Denise Carter. I used to work for Nolan Pierce. Another pause. I think you've been looking for answers about Claire. I have some. And I need to talk to someone before I lose my nerve completely. I looked across the table at Marcus. He had heard enough. His expression had shifted from focused to very still, the way it did when something important had just walked through the door. Tell me where you are, I said. We'll come to you. Denise Carter had chosen a coffee shop on Payne Avenue in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood, a narrow place with steamed-up windows and 4 small tables, the kind of establishment that had survived decades by being invisible to everyone except the people who needed it. She was already there when Marcus and I arrived, sitting at the table farthest from the door, with her back against the wall and both hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She was 38 years old, dark-haired, with the carefully composed expression of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of concentration. She looked up when we walked in, and I saw the exact moment she almost stood up and left a slight shift of weight, a tightening around her eyes, before she made herself stay put. Mr. Hayes. She looked at Marcus. And you are? Marcus Bell. I'm a retired financial investigator. I've been helping Walter understand what happened to his daughter. Marcus sat down across from her, unhurried, his voice matter of fact. Before we go any further, I want to address something. If Nolan Pierce had you sign a non-disclosure agreement during your employment, I need you to know that it has no legal force in the context of a federal criminal investigation. Under 18 United States Code, Section 1512, using a contractual agreement to prevent someone from cooperating with federal authorities is itself a crime, one that Nolan would be committing, not you. You are protected. Denise looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her shoulders came down about half an inch. He paid me $60,000 when I left, she said. And yes, I signed an NDA. I told myself it was just severance. She pressed her lips together. I knew it wasn't. Why are you coming forward now? I asked. She looked at me directly for the first time. Because 6 months ago, he stopped making the quarterly payments he promised me. And last week, I found out he's planning to cut every financial tie to anyone who worked for him before the company went public. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. I could see them trembling slightly against the cup. I know what that means. I've watched him do it before. I'm next. She reached into her bag and placed a small external hard drive on the table between us. Before I left the company, she said, I made a complete backup of the corporate server onto this drive. I did it on my own personal laptop, using my own credentials, because I was afraid Nolan would try to blame me for things I had only done because he told me to. She looked at Marcus. I don't know if it's legal. Ohio is a one-party consent state when it comes to recorded communications, Marcus said. You backed up files that were sent to your own work account on your own device. The evidence is yours to provide. He reached across and picked up the drive carefully, as though it were something fragile. What's on it? Denise took a slow breath. Everything, she said. Emails between Nolan and his private accountant, transfer records between the subsidiary companies, and the night before, Claire signed her plea agreement. Her voice caught for just a moment, a small break she covered quickly. There are messages between Nolan and a man named Travis Mead about what to do if Claire ever tried to take back her confession. I felt something drop through the floor of my stomach. Denise, I said quietly, tell me about the night Claire signed. She looked down at the table. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite tears, but was close enough to make my chest ache. I was still working there. Nolan kept me late that night, said he needed me to prepare some documents. I didn't know what was happening in his office. She paused. But I could hear her, through the wall. She was crying and asking him questions, and he was very calm. The way he gets when he's already decided something, and he's just waiting for the other person to catch up. What was she asking him? She kept asking about you. Denise looked at me, and her voice dropped. She kept saying, "Are you sure about my father? Are you absolutely sure he won't be touched?" And he kept telling her yes. He kept saying he had spoken to people, that he had assurances that, as long as she signed, you would never hear another word about it. She pressed her hand flat against the table. She was in there for almost 6 hours. When she came out, she looked like someone who had just made a decision they knew they couldn't undo. The coffee shop felt very small suddenly. The sound of the espresso machine and the street noise outside seemed to come from a long distance away. She asked about me for 6 hours, I said. Yes. I stood up abruptly and walked to the window and stood there looking out at Payne Avenue with my hands in my pockets and my jaw clenched so hard my back teeth ached. A bus rolled past. A woman pushed a stroller over a crack in the sidewalk. Everything outside looked completely normal, which felt like an insult. Marcus gave me a moment. Then he said from the table behind me, "Denise, there are emails on this drive about Travis Mead. Can you tell us who he is?" He did jobs for Nolan, the kind that don't go on any official payroll. Her voice was careful now, each word placed deliberately. After Claire got out of prison and started asking questions, Nolan told Travis to handle it. I saw the messages. I didn't understand what they meant at the time. I told myself, I didn't want to understand. I turned around from the window. "When were those messages sent?" I asked. Denise looked up at me. "November 15th, 2023. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up a calendar. He looked at me. November 15th, 2023. I had to sit back down. My legs had stopped being reliable. That was Claire's birthday. Before I show you what Marcus found on that hard drive, I need to stop for just a second. Because what comes next changed everything for me, and I don't think I'm ready to say it out loud without knowing you're still here. If you're with me, drop Claire in the comments right now. That's all. Just that one word. It'll mean more than you know. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The espresso machine behind the counter hissed and spat. Someone outside on Payne Avenue was laying on their car horn. The world kept moving at its regular speed, indifferent to the fact that everything in my chest had just stopped. November 15th, 2023. Claire Margaret Hayes was born on November 15th, 1992. I remember the exact weight of her when the nurse placed her in my arms. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had Ruth's eyes already. I could see it even then, even in those first 40 minutes, and she grabbed my finger like she already knew I was hers, and she wasn't going to let go. Ruth laughed at me from the bed and said I was going to be completely useless as a father because I was already a wreck and the baby hadn't even cried yet. That was the day. That was the day Nolan Pierce sent a message to a man named Travis Mead telling him to take Claire out of the city and make sure she never made it back. On her birthday. "Read me the message," I said. My voice came out in a register I didn't recognize, low and flat like something had been pressed out of it. Marcus turned his laptop toward me. The message was brief. That was the worst part, how little space it took up on the screen. "She's remembering. Move her out of the city tonight. Don't let her get to the old man. 30 words. Sent at 2:14 in the afternoon on November 15th, 2023. I read it 3 times. Then I pushed the laptop back toward Marcus because I didn't trust myself to keep looking at it. Travis Mead, I said to Denise. What do you know about him? She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, squeezing it like she needed something to hold on to. He's done work for Nolan for years, off the books. Debt collection, mostly the kind where you don't send a letter, you send a person. Nolan used him whenever something needed to be handled without a paper trail. She hesitated. After I saw those messages, I tried to tell myself Travis just drove her somewhere, dropped her off outside the city. That's what I kept telling myself. She was found near the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, I said. She'd been pushed from a moving vehicle. She had a traumatic brain injury. She spent the next 14 months living on the streets without knowing her own name. I watched Denise's face go pale. That's what Travis did. Denise set the coffee cup down. Her hands were shaking badly enough that it rattled against the saucer. Oh God, she whispered. Oh God, I didn't think he would actually. Under Ohio law, Marcus said quietly, cutting in, before her guilt could spiral into something unmanageable. What you've just described is attempted murder. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 2923.02. And because this involved interstate wire communications, the text messages, the financial fraud that preceded it, the FBI has jurisdiction. He looked at her steadily. You are not responsible for what Travis Mead did. You are responsible for what you do right now today, with what you know. Denise pressed both palms flat on the table and took 3 slow breaths. Then she looked up at me. What do you need me to do? Everything you just told us, I said. In writing, on the record, to the FBI. She nodded once. It was a small movement, but it cost her something. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, and her eyes went bright with tears she refused to let fall. Whatever she had been protecting herself with for the past 3 years, she had just put it down. Marcus was already on his phone. He had a contact at the FBI's Cleveland field office, a man named Derek Simmons, who ran financial crimes investigations. They had worked 2 cases together during Marcus's time with the city. Marcus stepped outside to make the call, and I sat across from Denise in the small, steamed-up coffee shop on Payne Avenue, and neither of us had anything left to say that the moment hadn't already said for us. When Marcus came back inside, his expression had shifted the focused sorting look, replaced by something more purposeful. Simmons will see us Monday morning, he said. 8 o'clock, Carl B. Stokes Federal Building on Superior Avenue. He sat back down. He said to bring the drive and bring Denise. He looked at her. Are you all right with that? No, she said honestly, but I'll be there. I drove to Metro Health after we left the coffee shop. It was early afternoon by then, gray and cold, the kind of Sunday in Cleveland that makes you feel like the year is winding down whether you're ready or not. I parked in the visitor structure and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor and walked down the corridor to the room where Claire was sleeping. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than she did anywhere else. The IV line ran into her left arm. Her right hand lay open on top of the blanket palm, up the crescent scar on her wrist, pale against her skin. I pulled a chair up close and sat down. The silver necklace was on the bedside table. A nurse had removed it for the imaging scans and left it in a small plastic bag. I picked up the bag and held it in both hands. 31 years ago, I had held this woman when she was 40 minutes old. I had driven her to soccer practice and argued with her about curfews and danced badly at her wedding, while Ruth covered her face and pretended not to know me. And on her 31st birthday, while I was home in Parma watching television and thinking about putting the lawnmower away for winter, someone had pushed her out of a moving car. I pressed the plastic bag against my forehead and sat there in the quiet of the room with my eyes closed and my shoulders shaking, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for the first and only time because I knew that after today I couldn't afford to anymore. Tomorrow, there was work to do. The Carl B. Stokes United States Courthouse on Superior Avenue was the kind of building that reminded you in a very deliberate way that the federal government had been around longer than your problems and intended to remain so. 32 floors of gray granite and glass rising out of the lakefront end of downtown Cleveland, surrounded by flags that snapped in the November wind off Lake Erie. I had driven past it 100 times in 38 years of city work without ever having a reason to go inside. I had a reason now. Marcus and I arrived at 7:50 in the morning. Denise was waiting in the lobby, standing very straight in a dark coat, with a leather bag over her shoulder, looking like someone who had made a decision and was not going to allow themselves to unmake it. We cleared security together and rode the elevator to the 8th floor in the particular silence of people who have already said everything that needs saying and are now just waiting to begin. Agent Derek Simmons met us in a conference room with no windows and 2 other agents whose names I didn't catch. He was 45 years old, compact and direct, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and eyes that missed nothing. He shook our hands, poured coffee from a carafe on the side table, and sat down without any preamble. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "walk me through it from the beginning." So I did. I told him everything, finding Claire on West 41st Street, the hospital, the file under the name Catherine Lane, the conversation with Nolan Pierce in his 12th floor office, Marcus's discovery of the forged signatures and the 11 shell companies, and finally Denise and the hard drive and the 30-word message sent on a birthday that should have meant something completely different. Simmons listened without interrupting. One of the other agents took notes. The second watched me in the way that investigators watch people when they're deciding how much to believe them. When I finished, Simmons looked at Marcus. "The hard drive," he said. Marcus placed it on the table. Simmons picked it up, turned it over once, and handed it to one of the other agents without looking away from Marcus. "Ohio. One-party consent applies to the saved communications." Denise Carter was a direct recipient of every email and message on that device, Marcus said. Under Ohio Revised Code, Section 2933.5, 2, she had full legal authority to retain copies of communications sent to her own accounts. The backup was made on her personal laptop, using her personal login credentials. The evidence is clean. Simmons nodded slowly the way a man nods when he's heard what he needed to hear. "Miss Carter," he said, turning to Denise, "your non-disclosure agreement with Pierce Renewal Group." "I know it's void," she said. Her voice was steady. "Marcus explained it to me." "Good." Simmons folded his hands on the table. "Then let me tell you where we are. We have been aware of Nolan Pierce's financial activities for approximately 8 months. We had suspected wire fraud, specifically the movement of misappropriated municipal funds through a network of subsidiary entities, but we lacked the internal documentation to establish the chain of control conclusively." He looked at the hard drive in his colleague's hands. "What you've brought us today changes that." "What happens now?" I asked. "We build the case," Simmons said, "properly and completely. The charges will include conspiracy to commit wire fraud under 18 United States Code, Section 1343 forgery of federal documents under Section 5, 13 obstruction of justice witness tampering and attempted murder in connection with the incident at the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge." He paused. "This takes time, Mr. Hayes, weeks not days, and it requires absolute discretion from everyone in this room." "How much time?" "That depends on what the drive gives us and how quickly our forensic accountants can establish the money trail." He met my eyes. "I understand you want this resolved, but if we move too fast and give Pierce's attorneys an opening to challenge the evidence, we lose everything. The right way is the only way." I looked at my hands on the conference table. They were steady, which surprised me. "There's something else?" Marcus said. He slid a printed sheet across the table. "Our analysis of Pierce's recent financial activity shows he has been moving significant assets into an offshore account, Cayman Islands. Based on the transfer schedule, we believe he intends to complete the movement of approximately $2.3 million following a charity gala he is hosting at the Renaissance Cleveland Hotel on the 30th of November. That's 4 weeks from now." Simmons looked at the sheet. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, but it was there. "If those funds leave United States jurisdiction before we make an arrest," Marcus continued, "recovery becomes substantially more complicated. Even with the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty between the U.S. and the Cayman Islands, the process takes years." "I'm aware of that," Simmons said. "Then you understand why the timing matters." Simmons was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The gala on the 30th. Pierce is expected to sign a new investment agreement at that event, using funds from the offshore transfer." "Yes," Marcus said. "That would constitute money laundering under 18 United States Code, Section 1956. Simmons said almost to himself, If he signs that agreement at the event using those funds, we have him on an additional charge the moment the pen leaves the paper. He gathered the papers in front of him and aligned them into a neat stack. We'll be in contact, he said. In the meantime, nothing. No contact with Pierce. No discussions outside this room. No variations from your normal routines. He looked at me. Mr. Hayes, your daughter is in Metro Health. She's being discharged Thursday. Take her home. Take care of her. That is your job for the next 4 weeks. He stood and extended his hand. We'll handle the rest. I shook it. On the way down in the elevator, Marcus looked at me. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks, I said. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Outside, through the glass front of the building, Lake Erie was a flat sheet of pewter under the November sky stretching out to the horizon, and beyond, cold and enormous and completely indifferent to the fact that on the 30th of November, Nolan Pierce was going to walk into a room and find out that some things once set in motion cannot be stopped. I picked Claire up from Metro Health on the morning of Thursday, November 7th. She was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed when I arrived, already dressed, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window. The discharge nurse was going through a stack of paperwork, follow-up appointments, dietary guidelines, a referral to a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic who specialized in dissociative disorders. Claire signed where she was told to sign without reading any of it, which told me more about where she was than anything Dr. Wells had put in the chart. The silver necklace was back around her neck. I had asked the nurse to make sure of that. On the way to the truck, Claire stopped on the sidewalk outside the hospital entrance and looked up at the sky. It was a flat, colorless November sky, the kind that sits low over Cleveland like a lid. She stood there for a long moment, her face turned upward, breathing the cold air and slow and deliberate. You okay? I asked. It doesn't smell like the hospital out here, she said. She said it like it was a discovery. No, I said, it doesn't. She got into the truck without another word, and I drove us south toward Parma. We were on West 35th when she spoke again, unprompted, her eyes on the passenger window. There's a bakery on this street. They make apple turnovers. She said it the way you say something you're not sure is a memory or a dream. The sign is green and yellow. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The bakery was Kowalski's, not the hardware store, a different Kowalski's, a family operation that had been on that corner for 40 years. Claire and I used to stop there every October when she was small, right around this time of year, and she would always get an apple turnover and eat it in the truck on the way home and get powdered sugar on her jacket and complain that it wasn't her fault because the turnover was too full. Green and yellow sign, I said carefully. You're right. She didn't say anything else, but she kept looking out the window, and I noticed her eyes moving differently than they had in the shelter or the hospital, not scanning for exits, but taking things in, noticing, like a person slowly remembering how to look at the world instead of just watching it for threats. The house on Forestdale Drive looked small in the gray November light. It always did this time of year once the leaves were down and the yard looked bare. I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine and sat for a moment. This is where I live, I said. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. There's no pressure to do anything or be anywhere. Claire looked at the house through the windshield. Her expression was careful, the way you look at something that might mean something important and you're not sure yet what. Okay, she said. Inside, she moved slowly through the front hallway and into the living room, stopping to look at things the way a person does in a museum. The clock on the mantel, the braided rug, a ceramic dish Ruth had made in a pottery class 20 years ago, and that I had never been able to bring myself to put away. She stopped longest in front of the bookshelf, her eyes moving across the spines without touching anything. Then she saw the photographs on the wall. There were 7 of them framed, arranged in a loose cluster, the way Ruth had always liked. Claire as a baby, Claire at her first day of school, Ruth and I at Niagara Falls the year before the diagnosis. Claire at her high school graduation, grinning with her cap sideways because she said straight caps looked boring. Claire stood in front of them for a long time. Her right hand came up slowly and touched the edge of the frame holding the graduation photo, just the tips of her fingers against the wood. Her chin trembled once quickly, and then she pressed her lips together hard and dropped her hand. I made up the guest room, I said from the doorway. But if you'd rather have the couch, that's fine too. Whatever you're comfortable with. She turned away from the photographs. The guest room is fine. That night I heard her up at 3 a.m. I came out of my bedroom to find her standing at the living room window in the dark, looking out at the street. Her shoulders were rigid, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "There's a car parked out there," she said. Her voice was thin and tight. "It's been there for a while?" I looked. It was my neighbor Gerald's Buick, same spot it had occupied every night for the past 6 years. "That's Gerald's car," I said. "He's lived next door since 2008. He parks there every night." She stared at it for another long moment. Then she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Sorry," she said. "I don't know why You don't have to explain anything," I said. "You want some tea?" She looked at me. In the dark of the living room, with just the streetlight coming through the curtains, her face was very young and very tired. "Yes," she said. "Please." We sat at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning and drank chamomile tea, and I told her about the time I accidentally flooded the basement, trying to fix a pipe myself instead of calling a plumber, and how Ruth had stood in the doorway looking at 6 inches of water on the basement floor and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "Walter, I need you to explain to me why you thought that was a good idea." Claire laughed. It was small and brief and surprise-sounding, like something that had gotten out before she could think better of it. But it was real. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately after, like she'd done something wrong. But I had already heard it, and I was going to hold on to it for the rest of whatever came next. "Thank you, Mr. Walter," she said when we'd finished our tea. I watched her go back down the hallway to the guest room. Then I sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at the 2 empty mugs and thought about the box of photographs I had upstairs in the closet. Tomorrow morning, I decided I would bring one down. The routine had established itself naturally, the way routines do when 2 people are living carefully around each other and trying not to break anything. Every morning I got up at 6:30, made coffee, and set one photograph on the kitchen table before Claire came downstairs. Always face up, always in the center of the table where she would see it when she sat down. I never asked her to look at it. I never explained it or pointed to it or waited for a reaction. I just put it there the way you might leave a window open on a warm day, not forcing anything, just making room for something to come in if it wanted to. After breakfast, I would pick it up and put it back in the box upstairs. Some mornings she glanced at it and looked away. Some mornings she picked it up and held it for a minute before setting it back down. Once she traced the outline of Ruth's face with her fingertips slowly and then put the photo down and went to refill her coffee without a word. I did not comment on that either. I was learning in those weeks that the most important thing I could do for my daughter was to be steady, not eager, not desperate. Just there every morning with coffee and a photograph and absolutely no agenda beyond the next 20 minutes. 17 mornings passed that way. On the 17th morning, Sunday, November the 24th, I came downstairs before dawn and stood at the kitchen counter in the dark for a long time before I reached for the box. There was only one photograph left in it. I had been going in order, oldest to most recent, and this was the last one. The summer, Claire turned 26 a Saturday afternoon at Edgewater Park on the shore of Lake Erie. Ruth had insisted on a picnic, even though the forecast said possible thunderstorms, and we had spread a blanket on the grass above the beach and eaten cold fried chicken and argued cheerfully about whether the clouds coming in from the west looked threatening or merely interesting. In the photograph, Claire was leaning against my shoulder with her eyes closed, her face turned slightly into the wind off the lake. She looked completely at ease. Completely safe. Ruth sat beside us, holding the silver necklace up toward the sun, turning it slowly so the teardrop pendant caught the light, examining it the way she always did when she was thinking about something she wasn't ready to say yet. I set the photograph on the table and sat down to wait. Claire came downstairs at 7:15, wearing the gray sweatshirt she had adopted as her default since coming home. She poured herself coffee, added too much sugar the way she always had, and sat down across from me. She saw the photograph. She picked it up. I watched her face move through several things in the space of about 10 seconds. Recognition trying to surface, being pushed back down, surfacing again. Her eyes traveled from Ruth to the necklace to the figure leaning against my shoulder. Her lips parted slightly. Then her hands started to shake, not a little. The photograph trembled visibly between her fingers, and she pressed her other hand flat against the table to steady herself. But it didn't help, because the shaking was coming from somewhere much deeper than her hands. "That's me," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes. I'm leaning on you." "You always did that," I said carefully. "You used to say my shoulder was the right height for a pillow. You said that since you were about 7 years old. Something moved across her face, a wave of something enormous, the kind that doesn't announce itself before it hits. She pressed her lips together hard, her chin buckled. She shook her head once sharply like she was arguing with something inside herself. And then she lost that argument completely, and the tears came down her face in a way that told me they had been building for a very long time, maybe 3 years, maybe longer, held back by a wall that had just given way all at once. She put the photograph down on the table very carefully, like it was something that could break. Then she covered her face with both hands and cried. Not the quiet kind, the deep shaking from the bones kind, the kind that sounds like grief and relief at the same time, because that's exactly what it was. I got up from my chair and walked around the table and crouched down beside her and put my hand on her back and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that mattered as much as just being there. After a while, the shaking slowed. She dropped her hands from her face. She looked at me, eyes swollen, face red, a complete wreck, and she said one word. Dad. Not Mr. Walter. Dad. My throat closed so completely I couldn't have spoken if I'd tried. I put my arms around her and she leaned into me the way she had in the photograph, her head against my shoulder, and I held my daughter for the second time in 3 years. And this time, she held me back. We stayed like that for a long time. The coffee went cold. The morning light moved slowly across the kitchen floor. Outside, a cardinal landed on the branch of the apple tree in the backyard and sat there looking at nothing in particular with great intensity the way cardinals do. And I watched it over Claire's shoulder and thought about Ruth, who had always said cardinals were her favorite bird and who had believed with complete sincerity that they showed up when you needed them to. I don't know if that's true, but I'm not going to say it isn't. Eventually, Claire lifted her head. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and looked at me with the exhausted, hollowed-out expression of someone who has just put down a very heavy thing. I'm starting to remember, she said. Not everything, but things are coming back. Pieces. Take your time, I said. I think, she stopped, pressed her fingers against her lips. I think there are things I need to tell you about what happened, about why I didn't come home. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure she could feel it. Whenever you're ready, I said. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded. Then she reached out and picked up the photograph again and looked at it for a long moment, the three of us on a summer afternoon at Edgewater Park before everything went wrong. She's beautiful, Claire said softly, looking at Ruth. She really was, I said. She started talking the next morning, not all at once. The memories were still coming back in fragments, some sharp and clear, others blurred at the edges like photographs taken through wet glass. She would say something and then stop pressing her fingers to her temple, and I would wait, and after a moment she would find the next piece and continue. I sat across from her at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I listened to my daughter dismantle the last 3 years of my life, one sentence at a time. I remember the documents, she said. He spread them out on his desk. There were so many of them. He had my name on things I'd never seen before, invoices, authorization forms, letters to the city comptroller's office. He said he'd been building the paper trail for months. She looked down at her hands. I didn't even know what half of them were. I was never his finance director. I filed receipts. I made sure the utility bills got paid on time. That was all I did. I know, I said. He showed me your signature. Her voice dropped. On 3 financial guarantee documents. He said if the investigation expanded, the prosecutors would argue that you had been involved from the beginning, that you had used your city credentials to validate fraudulent work. He said they could take your pension, your house. She stopped, swallowed hard. He said you could go to prison. He said you were 62 years old and federal prison would kill you. I pressed my fist against my mouth and breathed through it. And you believed him, I said, not an accusation, just the truth of it sitting between us on the kitchen table. I believed him, she said. Her eyes filled up again, but she blinked it back fiercely like she was angry at herself for it. I know how that sounds. I know I should have called you. I know I should have gotten my own lawyer and fought it. But he was so certain and I was so scared, and he kept saying your name, and I couldn't think past you. I couldn't think about anything except keeping you safe. Claire, don't. She held up one hand. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault yet. I need to finish first. I closed my mouth and let her finish. She told me about the 18 months in the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia, a minimum security facility, which was the only mercy in any of it. She told me about the first month when she still believed Nolan would visit, would call, would do something to indicate that he hadn't simply used her, and walked away. She told me about the day the divorce papers arrived delivered by a correctional officer on a Tuesday morning, between breakfast and work detail, and how she had sat on her bunk and held them for 2 hours before she could make herself read them. When I got out, she said, I had $40 from the prison account and the clothes I'd been wearing when I went in. They drove me to a bus station in Lewisburg and gave me a ticket to Cleveland. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Nolan was waiting in the parking lot of the Greyhound station. I don't know how he knew which bus I was on. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my ears. He looked good, she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was worse than anger, a kind of flat, exhausted disbelief, like she was still slightly amazed that such a thing was possible. He was driving a new car. He said he wanted to give me something to get started. He handed me an envelope with $500 in it and said, she stopped, her mouth pressed into a thin line. He said, don't look for Walter. He's moved on. He has a new life, and he doesn't want to hear from you. I stood up from the table so fast my chair scraped back across the floor. I walked to the kitchen window and stood there with both hands gripping the edge of the counter looking out at the backyard, the apple tree, the garden bed Ruth had planted that I hadn't touched since she died, the gray November sky pressing down on all of it. Behind me, Claire kept talking. He gave me a letter, she said. He said it was from you. It had your signature on it. Her voice was very quiet. It said that I had brought shame to the family, that you wanted me to know you were done, that you didn't have a daughter anymore. I turned around. She was looking at me with eyes that had gone very steady and very still, like she had spent a long time learning how to hold this particular thing without dropping it. I knew your handwriting, she said. I thought I did, but I was so tired and he was so certain, and the letter looked so real. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry. I should have known. Stop, I said. My voice came out rough and cracked, and I didn't try to fix it. Stop apologizing. He forged that letter the same way he forged my signature on those financial documents. The same man, the same hands. You didn't fail to recognize my handwriting. He fooled you on purpose with practice and intention, because that's what he does. I came back to the table and sat down and put both my hands over hers on the coffee cup. You have nothing to apologize for, I said. Do you hear me? Nothing. She looked at our hands for a moment, then she told me the rest. The halfway house, the laundry job on Lorraine Avenue, the memories starting to surface 6 months after her release, fragmentary. At first my voice, the smell of the kitchen on Forestdale, drive the weight of the silver necklace. She had called Nolan in a moment of anger and told him she was starting to remember and that she was going to find out what really happened. 2 days later, a man she didn't recognize knocked on the door of the room she was renting and said Nolan wanted to meet, that he was ready to talk, that he had something for her, that it would only take an hour. She got into the car. She told herself it was because she wanted to look him in the eye when she said what she had to say. She knows now that was exactly what he was counting on. I knew something was wrong when we passed the on-ramp for I-90, she said. We were heading west out of the city. I told him to stop. He didn't stop. Her voice was flat and factual now, the way voices get when people are describing things they can only get through by not feeling them. I reached for the door handle. He grabbed my arm. I hit my head on something, and then I was outside and there was pavement, and then I don't remember anything else for a long time. She said it all without flinching, but when she finished, she pulled her hands out from under mine and wrapped them around herself, both arms crossed tight over her chest, and she rocked forward very slightly in the chair, the way a person does when their body is trying to comfort itself and not finding much to work with. I got up and went around the table and put my arms around her from behind, the way I used to when she was small and had a bad dream, and I held on while she shook. I've got you, I said into her hair. It's over. I've got you. It's not over, she said, muffled against my arm. It will be, I said. November 30th, I promise you. She didn't ask me what that meant. She just held onto my arms with both hands and breathed. My phone rang at 2:47 that afternoon. I was in the backyard doing the thing I do when I don't know what else to do with myself, which is find something physical to work on. I had pulled out the garden bed that Ruth had planted along the back fence, the one I hadn't touched since she passed, and I was turning the soil over with a spade, working methodically through the frozen hard top layer into the darker earth underneath. It wasn't the right time of year for it, I knew that. But my hands needed something to do that wasn't shake. The caller ID said Simmons D, FBI. I pulled off my work glove and answered it. Mr. Hayes. His voice had the same quality it always did, but measured unrushed, giving nothing away until he was ready to give it. I need you to come in tomorrow morning. There's been a development. What kind of development? The kind I'd rather discuss in person. A brief pause. 8 o'clock. Bring Marcus. I was at the Federal Building at 7:50 the next morning, with Marcus beside me and 3 hours of sleep behind me. Simmons was already in the conference room when we arrived, along with 2 agents I recognized from the first meeting, and a third I hadn't seen before, who was introduced only as a forensic accountant from the Financial Crimes Unit. Simmons waited until the door was closed. Then he put a single printed sheet on the table and slid it toward Marcus. Our financial forensics team has been tracing the movement of assets from Pierce Renewal Group's primary operating accounts over the past 6 weeks, he said. Specifically, we've been monitoring a series of wire transfers initiated from a subsidiary account registered in Delaware. He tapped the sheet. In the past 3 weeks alone, approximately $2.3 million has been moved in increments through 4 intermediate accounts and is currently staged in a private banking institution in the Cayman Islands. Marcus picked up the sheet and studied it. His expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. Staged, Marcus said, meaning it hasn't completed the transfer. Correct. The funds are sitting in a transitional account. Based on the transfer instructions, our team was able to intercept the final movement into a personal account beyond our jurisdictional reach, is scheduled to occur on the evening of November 30th. Simmons looked at me. The same evening as the Pierce Renewal Group charity gala at the Renaissance Cleveland Hotel. So he's planning to disappear the money right after the event, I said. After he signs a new investment agreement at the event, Simmons said. Our intelligence indicates that Harold Marsh, the father of Pierce's fiancée, has committed to a $14 million equity investment in Pierce Renewal Group. The signing is scheduled to take place at the gala as the ceremonial centerpiece of the evening. He paused. The investment funds would flow into the same account structure that received the misappropriated municipal money. Under 18 United States Code, Section 1956, knowingly conducting a financial transaction with criminally derived funds constitutes money laundering. The moment Pierce signs that agreement with those funds in front of witnesses, we have him on an additional charge that carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. So you need him to sign before you arrest him, Marcus said. We need him to sign yes. Simmons folded his hands on the table. We'll have agents positioned inside and outside the venue. The arrest will occur immediately following the signing. We'll also have a team executing a simultaneous warrant at Travis Mead's residence. We have a current address for him in Garfield Heights. He looked at me directly. Mr. Hayes, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. We don't need you at the gala. The case doesn't require your presence. But if you want to be there, you and your daughter, we can accommodate that. It would need to be handled carefully, and you would need to follow instructions without deviation. I looked at Marcus. He gave me nothing, just watched me letting me make my own call. I need to talk to Claire, I said. I drove home and found her in the living room sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up and the television on low, some home renovation show she wasn't really watching. She had been doing that more in the past week, sitting near the television without watching it, using the background noise the way some people use music, just to fill the space that silence left. I sat down in the armchair across from her and told her everything. The $2.3 million, the Cayman account, the gala on the 30th, the investment signing, the arrest. She listened without moving. Her face went through several things: concentration, recognition, something that might have been satisfaction hardening into something steadier and colder. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the vacant quiet of the shelter or the hospital, but the quiet of someone who is thinking precisely and carefully about what they want. He's going to stand up in front of all those people, she said slowly, and let them applaud him, and he thinks it's just another night. Yes, I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry and very clear. I want to be there, she said. I want him to see me walk into that room. I want him to know before they put the handcuffs on that I'm still alive and I'm standing up and it didn't work. Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that was iron straight through. Can you understand that? Yes, I said. I can understand that perfectly. She nodded once. Then she looked back at the television. November 30th, she said. 5 days, I said. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest and looked at the flickering screen. And I looked at my daughter, thinner than she should be, a faint scar still visible at her temple, still flinching sometimes, at cars that slowed down on the street outside. And I thought about what it cost a person to survive the things she had survived and still be willing to walk back into a room. It cost everything, and she was going to do it anyway. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about 5 days and what 5 days was and what came after it. I did not sleep for a long time. I woke up at 4:58 in the morning on November 30th and lay in the dark and listened to the house. Nothing moved, the furnace clicked and hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly on Forestdale Drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the bedroom's ceiling and then gone. I watched the light move and disappear and thought about all the mornings in the past 3 years when I had woken up like this too early, the house too quiet, that particular hollow feeling that comes from sleeping in a space built for more people than are in it. Today was the last day of that, one way or another. I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark without turning on the lights. I had learned in the past 3 weeks that Claire slept better in the early morning hours than at any other time. Something about the quality of the light or the quiet of the neighborhood before the day started. I didn't want to wake her. I sat with my coffee and I thought about Ruth. She would have known what to say this morning. She always knew not big words, not speeches, just the exact right small thing at the exact right moment. She would have sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around her own cup and said something that managed to be both completely obvious and something I hadn't thought of, and I would have felt better without quite knowing why. I missed her so badly in that moment that it sat in my chest like a stone. I heard footsteps on the stairs at 6:30. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was already dressed dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse, and she was carrying something over her arm. She held it up when she saw me looking. It was a dress, deep blue, almost navy with a simple cut and 3/4 sleeves. The fabric caught the kitchen light and shifted slightly the way good fabric does. I found it in the hall closet, she said, in a garment bag on the top shelf. I think it was Mom's. My throat tightened. It was Ruth's. She had worn it to Claire's college graduation dinner, a restaurant downtown, that we'd saved up for the 3 of us crowded around a table too small for the occasion. Claire, Ruth, and me, laughing too loudly and not caring. Ruth had looked beautiful in it. She always said blue was the only color worth wearing. It was hers, I said. Claire looked down at it. Is it okay if I wear it tonight? I had to look away for a moment out the kitchen window at the bare apple tree in the backyard. I pressed my thumb hard into my palm and held it there until I had myself back. She would have wanted you to, I said. She would have insisted. Claire went upstairs to change. When she came back down, I was standing in the hallway and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me with a question in her eyes, asking something she didn't have words for, yet something about whether she looked all right, whether this was okay, whether they were allowed to do this to dress up and walk into a room and take back something that had been stolen. You look like her, I said. You look exactly like her. Her chin trembled once. She pressed her lips together and lifted her chin. Don't make me cry before we even leave, she said. I just fixed my face. I laughed. It surprised me the sound of it in the hallway, real and sudden. Claire smiled, and for just a moment, she looked exactly like the woman in the photograph at Edgewater Park, leaning into the wind off the lake with her eyes closed. I held the door open. Ready, I said. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She squared her shoulders. She walked past me into the cold November evening, like someone who had been waiting 3 years to take this particular step and was done waiting. Let's go, she said. Before I tell you what happened inside that ballroom, I want you to know that my daughter walked through those doors in her mother's dress 3 years after everything was taken from her, and she didn't shake once. If you've made it this far with us, comment "still here" so I know. Because what happens next, I've been waiting 3 years to say. The Renaissance Cleveland Hotel on Public Square had been built in 1918, and had survived 100 years of the city's rises and collapses with the particular stubbornness of things that were made well and know it. The ballroom on the second floor could hold 400 people. Tonight it was holding approximately 350, and every one of them was dressed in the kind of clothes that announced loudly and without apology that the person wearing them had not worried about money in quite some time. Claire and I stood just inside the entrance to the ballroom for a moment. She was looking across the room at the stage. I was looking at her. Her face was very still. Not the empty stillness of the shelter or the hospital, this was different. This was the stillness of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to do and has made their peace with it. "He's up there," she said. I looked. Nolan Pierce was standing at the podium on the low stage at the far end of the ballroom, one hand resting on the surface in front of him, the other holding a glass of champagne. He was wearing a black tuxedo. He looked from this distance like a man who had never done a wrong thing in his life and fully expected to spend the rest of it this way. Beside me, Claire's hand found my arm. Her fingers closed around it, not out of fear, I realized, but because she needed something solid to be next to. "Ready," I said. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. We walked in. I don't know exactly when people started to notice us. It happened gradually, the way a sound grows when you start paying attention to it. First, the people nearest the entrance, then the tables beyond them, conversations slowing and stopping in widening rings as we moved through the room. By the time we were halfway to the stage, the section of the ballroom behind us had gone almost completely quiet. On the stage, a woman in an evening gown was midway through an introduction. She kept speaking for a few more seconds before the change in the room reached her, and she faltered, losing her place, her eyes moving out over the audience. Nolan looked up. I watched it happen across his face. The recognition, the comprehension, the color leaving his skin so completely and so fast that even from 20 feet away, I could see the change. The champagne glass tilted in his hand. He caught it barely. He looked at Claire for a very long moment, and then he looked at me, and then he looked back at Claire, and I could see him doing the calculation, trying to figure out what this was, and what it meant, and how bad it was, and whether there was any version of the next 60 seconds that he could control. There wasn't. Claire stepped forward. Her voice when she spoke was completely steady. Not loud, she didn't need to be loud, because the room was quiet enough that every word carried. 3 years ago, she said, "You told me that if I didn't confess to crimes I didn't commit, my father would be arrested. You told me he would lose his pension and his home and go to prison. You told me you would protect him if I signed." A sound went through the room, not quite a gasp, more like the collective intake of breath that happens when 350 people simultaneously understand that something real is occurring. Nolan set the champagne glass down on the podium with a precise click. "Claire." His voice was very controlled. "This isn't the place. You also told me," she continued as if he hadn't spoken, "that my father had written me a letter saying he wanted nothing to do with me. You forged his signature. You gave me that letter on the day I was released from prison, and I believed it, and I spent 14 months living on the streets of this city because I thought the only person in the world who would have helped me didn't want to." At the front table, a young woman in a red gown had risen to her feet. She was staring at Nolan with an expression that had started as confusion and was rapidly becoming something much colder. "Nolan!" Her voice was sharp, precise, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. "Who is this woman?" "Victoria. You told me your ex-wife died." Victoria Marsh's voice cracked on the last word, not with grief, with fury. "You told me she passed away after her release. You made me feel sorry for you." The man beside Victoria, Harold Marsh. 60-something, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had spent a lifetime moving large amounts of money and was not accustomed to surprises, slowly picked up the folder on the table in front of him. The one containing the investment agreement. He looked at it for a moment, then set it back down without opening it. Nolan stepped down from the stage. He moved toward Claire with his hands slightly raised, his voice dropping to something that was trying very hard to be reasonable. "You're not well," he said. "You've been through a great deal, and I understand that, but this isn't Mr. Pierce." The voice came from behind us. Agent Derek Simmons walked through the ballroom entrance with 5 agents behind him, all of them moving with the particular unhurried certainty of people who have a warrant in their pocket and nowhere else to be. The room went absolutely still. Simmons crossed the floor and stopped directly in front of Nolan Pierce. Nolan Pierce. He said, You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, forgery of federal documents, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and attempted murder. He paused for just a beat. You have the right to remain silent. Nolan looked at Simmons, then at me, then at Claire. And for the first time in everything I had seen of him, the smooth lobby handshake, the 12th floor office, the calculated calm of a man who always believed he was the smartest person, managing any situation he had absolutely nothing to say. One of the agents moved behind him with handcuffs. Harold Marsh stood up, picked up the investment folder from the table, and handed it to his assistant without a word. The message was clear enough without one. Victoria sat back down in her chair, very slowly, both hands pressed flat on the table, staring at a point somewhere in front of her that wasn't anything in the room. The agent behind Nolan clicked the handcuffs into place with a sound that was very small and very final in the quiet of the ballroom. Nolan stood with his wrists behind his back and looked around the room one time, a slow, almost involuntary sweep, the way a man looks when he's trying to locate something familiar to hold on to and finding nothing. 350 people looked back at him. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. The only sound was the faint clink of ice settling in an abandoned glass somewhere near the back of the room. Then he looked at Claire. She was standing 6 feet away from him, her hands at her sides, the deep blue dress catching the chandelier light above her. She was not crying, she was not shaking. She stood exactly as she had when she walked in, shoulders back, chin level, with the particular stillness of someone who has finally put down something they carried too long and can feel the absence of the weight. "You don't understand," Nolan said. His voice had lost its smoothness. Something underneath it had cracked through. "I built something real. Everything I did, the company, the community projects, the jobs I created, that was all real. Whatever else happened, that was real." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "The company was real," she said. "You built it with money you stole using my name while I was in a federal prison. And then you made sure I had nothing left when I got out so I couldn't fight back." Her voice was very quiet and very precise, each word placed exactly where she meant it to go. "You didn't build something real, Nolan. You built something on top of me, and now you're going to have to figure out how to explain the difference to a federal judge." Nolan's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, down at the floor, at the handcuffs on his wrists, at nothing in particular. And for the first time, I saw something in his face that might have been genuine. Not remorse exactly. More like the sudden vertiginous understanding that the story he'd been telling himself for 3 years had just run out of room. One of the agents took him by the arm. They moved toward the door. He didn't say anything else. As they walked past me, Nolan turned his head and looked at me directly. I don't know what he was looking for. An acknowledgement, maybe, some version of recognition from the man whose family he had destroyed that said he understood how it had all made a certain kind of sense. I didn't give him anything. I watched him go. Agent Simmons appeared at my elbow a moment later, quiet and businesslike as always. "Travis Meade was taken into custody at his residence in Garfield Heights approximately 11 minutes ago," he said. "No resistance. He'll be arraigned Monday morning in federal court." He paused. "The Cayman transfer has been blocked. The funds are frozen pending forfeiture proceedings." "The Cayman transfer has been blocked. The funds are frozen pending forfeiture proceedings." He paused. "And for the record, Pierce initialed the first page of the Marsh investment agreement before you two walked in." His signature touched that document. "Under 18 United States Code, Section 1956, that's sufficient for the money laundering charge." "Thank you," I said. "Thank your daughter," Simmons said. Then he moved away into the controlled activity that was now filling the room, agents with tablets, conversations being had in corners, the careful machinery of consequence doing its work. I turned to Claire. She was looking at the stage. The podium was empty now. The champagne glass Nolan had set down was still there, half-full, condensation beating on the outside. And on the edge of the stage where the presenter had placed it, before everything unraveled, sat the award. A heavy crystal trophy, maybe 10 inches tall, etched with the words, "Pierce Renewal, Group Community Leadership, Award 2024. Nobody had picked it up. I watched Claire look at it for a long moment. Her expression moved through something complicated, grief and anger, and something that wasn't quite either of those, something that might have been the specific exhaustion of a person who has wanted justice for so long that when it finally arrives, it doesn't feel the way they imagined it would. It feels quieter, heavier, more like an ending than a victory. Then she turned away from it. "Can we go?" she said. "Yes," I said. "We can go." We walked back through the ballroom, the way we had come in, past the tables and the people who stepped aside to let us pass through the entrance, and out into the corridor, and down the stairs, and through the lobby, and out through the heavy front doors of the Renaissance Cleveland Hotel onto Public Square. The cold hit us both at once. Lake Erie winds straight off the water, cutting through Ruth's blue dress and my suit jacket like they were made of paper. Claire gasped slightly at the shock of it and then laughed a short, involuntary sound, not entirely happy, but entirely real. "Cold," she said. "November in Cleveland," I said. She took my arm the way she used to when she was small, and we walked somewhere together in winter, tucking her hand into the crook of my elbow and leaning in slightly against the wind. We stood at the top of the steps for a moment, looking out at the square, the fountain turned off for the season, the trees bare, the streetlights making orange halos in the cold, dark air. "Is it over?" she said. I thought about everything that was still ahead, the legal proceedings, the motion to vacate her conviction, the months of paperwork and hearings, and the slow grinding work of reclaiming a life that had been deliberately dismantled. None of that was going to be fast or easy or painless. "The worst of it is," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Okay," she said. "That's enough for tonight." We walked down the steps together into the cold, and I didn't look back. The legal process took 11 months. I want to be honest about that because people who haven't been through it tend to imagine that justice works the way it does. In movies, a gavel comes down, a verdict is read, and by the time the credits roll, everything has been sorted into its proper place. The reality is quieter and slower and considerably more exhausting, full of procedural filings and continuances and waiting rooms and phone calls from lawyers that begin with the words, "So there's been a development," in a tone that tells you nothing about whether the development is good or bad until 3 sentences later. Claire filed her motion to vacate the conviction in December, 2 weeks after Nolan's arrest. Under 28 United States Code, Section 2255, a federal prisoner, or in Claire's case, a former federal prisoner, can petition the sentencing court to vacate, set aside, or correct a sentence on the grounds that it was imposed in violation of the Constitution. The legal argument her attorney built rested on 2 foundations. The first was what lawyers call a Brady violation, named for a 1963 Supreme Court case that established the government's obligation to disclose evidence favorable to the defense. In Claire's case, the prosecution had relied on 3 financial guarantee documents bearing her signature and Walter's. Those documents were fabricated. The government hadn't known that, but the man who provided them had, and the forensic analysis of the signatures, combined with Nolan's own statements to federal investigators after his arrest, established beyond any reasonable doubt that the evidentiary foundation of Claire's conviction was built entirely on manufactured proof. The second foundation was coercion. Claire's guilty plea entered under what she had believed was the imminent threat of her father's arrest, and imprisonment had not been made freely and voluntarily in the legal sense of those words. A plea agreement signed under duress based on false information provided by the person who stood to benefit from her conviction is not a valid waiver of constitutional rights. The court agreed. On October 9, 2025, a federal judge in the Northern District of Ohio vacated Claire's conviction and expunged her record. The courtroom was small and not particularly dramatic. There was no crowd, no press, no moment of cinematic release. The judge read the ruling in a level voice. The clerk made a notation, and that was that. Claire sat beside her attorney and looked at the surface of the defense table for a long moment after the ruling was read. Then she looked up at me, where I was sitting in the gallery behind the bar, and she pressed her lips together very hard and nodded once. I nodded back. That was enough. Nolan Pierce entered a guilty plea in August of 2025 to avoid a trial. His attorneys negotiated a reduced charge on the attempted murder count in exchange for his full cooperation with the federal investigation into the broader network of municipal contract fraud. There had been other projects, other shell companies, other cities. The final sentence was 17 years in a federal correctional facility with no possibility of parole for the first 12. Under the terms of the asset forfeiture agreement governed by 18 United States Code, Section 981, The majority of his remaining assets, including the Cayman funds that had been frozen the night of his arrest, were seized and applied toward restitution to the city of Cleveland and the other municipalities affected by the fraud. Pierce Renewal Group was dissolved in February. Travis Mead pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and attempted murder under Ohio law and received a sentence of 12 years. He offered no statement at sentencing. Neither did I, though I had written one, and then decided not to read it. Some things don't need to be said in a courtroom to be true. I want to tell you about a Saturday in October. It was the kind of October day that Cleveland occasionally produces, as if to apologize for everything else, clear and sharp and full of light. The maples on Forestdale Drive gone red and orange and gold all at once. The air smelling of leaves and cold, and the particular mineral freshness that comes in off Lake Erie when the wind is right. Claire had signed a lease on an apartment on Broadview Road in Old Brooklyn, 3 miles from my house in the same neighborhood where Marcus Bell lived. It was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that had good bones and needed paint, which was fine because Claire had decided she wanted to paint it herself. She had specific ideas about this. I showed up at 8 in the morning with 2 coffees and a bag of apple turnovers from Kowalski's Bakery. Claire opened the door in old jeans and a paint-spattered shirt she'd bought at a thrift store, specifically for the occasion, her hair pulled back, a roller in one hand. The apartment smelled of fresh plaster and possibility. "You're late," she said. "I'm exactly on time," I said. "I brought turnovers." She took the bag, looked inside, and smiled in a way that went all the way up to her eyes. The full version of the smile I had been waiting 3 years to see again, the one that looked exactly like Ruth's, and nothing like it at the same time, because Claire had always been her own person, and always would be. "Come in," she said. "We have a lot of wall." The paint was yellow. Not a bright yellow, more the color of late afternoon light, the color of the kitchen on Forestdale Drive, when the sun came through the west window. In the early evening, the color that Ruth had always said made a room feel like someone lived in it and meant it. Claire had found a chip of it at the hardware store and held it up and said, "This one," with such certainty that I didn't ask any questions. We worked through the morning rolling paint onto the walls of the living room, while a radio on the floor played oldies that neither of us were really listening to. We talked about small things, her new job at the transitional housing nonprofit on the west side, where she was helping women who had recently been released from incarceration navigate the paperwork and bureaucracy of starting over. We talked about the fact that she had started sleeping through the night most nights now, which she mentioned in the same tone she might use to report that the weather had improved. We talked about Thanksgiving, and whether I was going to attempt to cook again this year, or whether she was going to take over the kitchen, as she had been threatening to do since she was 14. She had not asked about Nolan since the sentencing. She had read the coverage once briefly, and then put her phone down and gone for a walk and come back and made dinner. Whatever she felt about it, she was keeping in a place I couldn't see, and I had learned in the past 11 months that there were rooms inside my daughter that were hers alone, and that the most loving thing I could do was not knock on every door. Late in the afternoon, we ran out of paint for the living room and stopped. Claire stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at the walls. The yellow was exactly right, warm without being sweet, substantial without being heavy, the kind of color that makes a room feel like it has always been that color and couldn't possibly be anything else. "It looks good," she said. "It looks like home," I said. She looked at me. Then she looked down at her hands. The roller still in one, a smear of yellow paint on the back of the other, the silver necklace just visible above the collar of the paint-spattered shirt. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Okay." "Do you blame me?" Her voice was very quiet. For any of it, for believing him, for not fighting harder, for the 3 years. She looked up. Her eyes were dry and direct and completely serious. "I need to know the real answer." I set my roller down on the tray. I thought about the answer for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because she deserved to receive it carefully, the way you hand something fragile to someone whose hands you trust. "No," I said. "I don't blame you for a single day of it. You were lied to by someone who spent years learning exactly which lies would work on you. You made a decision based on manufactured fear, with no information that could have told you it was false because you loved me." I looked at her steadily. "I lost 3 years. You lost everything, and you survived it, and you're standing here in a room you painted yellow because it was your mother's favorite color, and you start a new job on Monday and you sleep through the night. I shook my head slowly. I don't blame you. I am in awe of you. There's a difference. Claire's chin buckled. Her hand came up to her mouth. She pressed the back of her wrist against her lips and stood there for a moment in the center of her yellow living room with the late October sun coming through the windows and turning everything warm and gold. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around me and pressed her face against my shoulder, the way she had in every photograph from every year of her life. And I held my daughter in the home she was building for herself, and felt her shoulders shake and then steady, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the yellow walls around us, and somewhere outside on Broadview Road, a car drove past, playing music that faded as quickly as it came. After a while, she lifted her head. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rough and clear at the same time. "Anytime," I said. She pulled back and looked at the walls again. Then she reached up and touched the silver necklace at her throat, the way she did sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it, checking that it was still there, that it was still real. "I'm going to be okay," she said. She didn't say it the way people say it when they're trying to convince themselves. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather level, certain based on available evidence. "I know," I said. "I've known that for a while." She picked her roller back up off the tray. "Come on," she said. "We still have the bedroom." I picked up mine. Outside, the October light was going gold and long across the rooftops of old Brooklyn, and the maples on Broadview Road were on fire with color. And my daughter was painting her first home yellow, and 3 years ago, I had sat in an empty house and not known if she was alive. I had done one thing right in all of it. I had not stopped looking. That turned out to be enough. Looking back, I was the worst kind of blind, not because I couldn't see, but because I stopped looking. My daughter was surviving on the streets of the same city I drove through every single day, and I told myself she had chosen to leave. Don't be like me. If someone you love goes quiet, suddenly completely don't accept the easy explanation. Every family story has hidden chapters. The ones that matter most are always the ones being buried. I've learned that real love isn't the feeling you have when everything is fine. It's what you do when everything has collapsed and you don't know where to start. My grandfather always said, God doesn't put people in our path by accident. I believe that now. Claire was put back in mine on a cold October afternoon beside a trash can on West 41st Street, and I almost drove past her. This was my family story. A story of family betrayal I never saw coming, silence I mistook for abandonment, and 3 years I cannot get back. But also a story of a daughter who loved her father more than she loved her own future. If you've ever witnessed family betrayal, or carried a burden alone to protect someone, tell me in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. Share this family story if it reached you, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying to the very end. A heads up, some of our upcoming stories contain fictionalized elements built around real human experiences. If that's not for you, no judgment, find what speaks to you. But if you're still here, we're grateful.